The overall theme is that we are at the end of an era, that globalization was a moment in time that the United States created artificially in order to generate alliance to fight the Cold War. And in the 8 elections since the Cold War ended, the American population has always gone with the candidate who was less globalist and more populist. That includes Biden. So we've been moving this way for a long time. It's not an aberration, it's a pattern. And without globalization, most of the major economies in the world have to, at a minimum, retool. And for many of them, that's the end of their systems. The other piece is depopulation. We've finally passed the point where the problem is no longer overpopulation. The problem is that as globalization took hold, everyone everywhere was able to move off the farm and into the town. On the farm, kids are free labor, and in the town, they're really expensive annoyances, and adults aren't dumb, so they have fewer of them. You carry that out for 75 years, and you don't just run out of children, you run out of 20-somethings and 40-somethings. Most of the major countries of the world have now aged past the point of no return, and this was always going to be the decade where they moved into mass retirement. You play these things two together, and the whole system starts to spin apart. The Ukraine war is a piece of that. Countries looking to attach themselves to a superior power is a piece of that. The evolution of China and Japan and Russia are pieces of that. And the whole point of the book is to show what happens on the backside in terms of the major economic sectors, whether it's transport or finance or agriculture.
Let me ask you about one little piece of what you said there, which is you made the case that Biden is actually more populist and less globalist than Trump. What is your sort of lay out your view of that? Because I think that would go against a lot of conventional wisdom.
Oh, it certainly does. Everyone assumes that Trump, since he was the one who threw the fits and broke trade deals, is the one who's the more populist. And I don't mean to suggest that he wasn't. He certainly was. But what Biden has done is fundamentally different. Trump would tweet out that we're pulling out of this or that, or we're leveling tariffs on countries, and then he would walk away. Sometimes he'd even fire the people who were responsible for making those policies happen because he was a relatively volatile personality. Biden is coming in, and Biden is reinforcing every decision that Trump made on trade with actual code, with actual executive orders, with actual bureaucrats to enforce it. So Biden and Trump, from a foreign economic policy point of view, actually have the two most similar foreign policies in this country's history. The difference is that Biden is making it stick.
Can you just give one very specific example of that?
Sure, China tariffs. The phase one deal never really went through because Trump never really implemented it. All the tariffs stayed in place, and Trump and his trade czar, Catherine Tai, have basically extended those into perpetuity and formed a bit of an alliance with some of the other Western countries to make it not just an American thing, but global. And that's one of the reasons why companies like Huawei are facing such a catastrophic problem. Everyone assumed that as soon as the Trump administration went away, this would all just fade away. And instead, it is now fully embracing American trade law.
Peter, I think one of the interesting things you said there was what the end of globalization looks like on the back end. I mean, give us a 20-year or so preview here of going forward. What can Americans see change geopolitically in their lifetimes, given the fact we've already seen such a major geopolitical change in just the last, I'd say 10 years. It's changed the landscape dramatically. It's
been a really last 3 months from my point of view. But yeah, the whole book is on that topic. So for example, transport is international, safe and cheap transport is the foundation of all manufacturing supply chains, the entire global energy market, and the entire global agricultural market. There are now parts of the Black Sea that have already become a no-go zone, which have taken the world's largest wheat exporter, Russia, and the fourth largest wheat exporter, Ukraine, off the market. The Russians are having a similar problem with their fertilizer because it is exported through that same no-go zone. So we are already looking down the maw of a global wheat crisis that this year is going to, at a minimum, triple, probably quadruple wheat prices. At the same time, we have a global fertilizer shortage, which is going to reduce yields on a global basis. We're not going to have to wait 10 years. We're looking at that right now. So as you move off the farm and into the city, you have fewer kids. You play that forward for a few decades, and fewer kids becomes fewer young workers, becomes fewer mature workers. I think a great case study is South Korea. South Korea is a country that wasn't industrialized at all, certainly wasn't globalized when it got independence from the Japanese at the end of World War II. They started to develop in 1950, and steadily over the course of the next 4 decades, they went from the most rural country in the world to the most urbanized country in the world. And they're now, 30 years after that, in an environment where they have more people in their 60s than their 50s, than their 40s, than their 30s, than their teens, than children. For a while, that works for you. Because if you have a lot of workers aged 30 to 50, but not a lot of kids, all the money that is normally spent on school and diapers is instead spent on cars and condos. And you get this massive generation of economic growth from the consumption side. At the same time, the higher investment and tax levels from those more mature workers can be building out infrastructure and industrial plant on the industrial side. And so we've seen this story over and over again in Germany, in Korea, in Japan, in China. But it's a bit of a starvation diet. Because if you then fast forward another 10 years, you're talking about that bulge that right now is in the 50s being in their 60s and then retiring. And in that sort of environment, you just have a complete collapse of production and investment and consumption all at the same time. And we're now looking at about half the developing world going through that process right now. So the growth we had from roughly 1995 to roughly 2015, the fastest economic expansion in human history, was about all of them being in that magic demographic moment before they flipped. Now they're flipping. As populations decline, the capacity for them to participate in normal economic activity collapses because you have to have sufficient young people to get it going, and that's no longer an option for a lot of countries. So the model of capitalism or socialism or fascism or communism, or whichever ism you happen to be a fan of, they were all designed for the market getting a little bit bigger every year, and they can't cope with a market that's in terminal decline. In terms of global affairs, if you don't have safety on the high seas, and the US is the only country that can even pretend to guarantee that, the steps that allow for modern manufacturing supply chains, the complexity that brings us the goods that we use every day, that breaks down. In that sort of environment, individual countries will feel forced, or out of a sense of opportunity, to take matters into their own hands and try to generate regional manufacturing hubs, regional spheres of influence. The problem is that the resources you need to fuel a modern, industrialized, post-globalist world are not equally spread out around the world. They're very concentrated. So oil in the Persian Gulf, cobalt in Congo, nickel in northern Russia, for example. Not everyone can reach everything. The United States should be pretty much okay because we're going to be combining the Western Hemisphere with maybe the Japanese and Southeast Asia. But for everyone else, you're looking at sharply truncated capacity to access the inputs that allow modern life to happen. So we're seeing some of this going on right now with the Ukraine war. There are a number of countries who are completely reliant on globalization to allow them to import energy. China's probably at the top of that list. And in a world where Russian crude is going offline bit by bit, that means the entire map of where crude can go is going to reshuffle. So it's probably going to look something like this. As the Russian crude falls offline, the Europeans, who are their primary customer, are going to go back and reinterface with countries closer to them that they have better relations with, primarily former colonies. That's North Africa and West Africa. There's enough there, plus Norway, to supply the Europeans. But that means that Russian crude is going offline and North and West African crude is going offline. That means there's not enough left to go to East Asia. Now, the Japanese have a navy. They can reach the Western Hemisphere, work with the Americans, still get supplies in. But China can't. China's a good example of a country that is absolutely screwed from this new sort of environment. They've mined most of their own country out, and the resources that they need from further abroad are concentrated in certain footprints that the Chinese can't reach. So China and a lot of countries in the broader world will not be able to access affordable and ample energy supplies to maintain their current system. And they also can't reach the cobalt and the nickel and the copper that is needed to maybe try their hand at the green transition. And in that sort of environment, you're not just looking at a trade breakdown in East Asia, and a population bust. You're looking at a loss of the inputs that are necessary to maintain today's economy, much less the future one. And that suggests a screaming reverse in economic activity and a deindustrialization of the system. That doesn't simply make the Chinese no longer rich. It puts the Chinese in an environment where they they have to go back to subsistence rice paddy agriculture just to prevent their population from dying out. Some version of this is going to play out in large parts of the world. I'm specifically concerned with sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East, a little bit in South Asia, and absolutely in Central Europe. Let's start with the demographic picture since we've already kind of established that. The one-child policy has been in place for 40 years, and that means that the Chinese are running out of 30-year-olds. That's just how math works. Anyone who suggests that the Chinese think long-term or are good at math really needs to take a closer look at their system. Also, with the more recent census data that has come out, they are now admitting grudgingly that they've overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people. Now, the Chinese system, as of 2 years ago, before this new census data had come out, they were already the fastest aging and fastest demographically collapsing country in human history. And now with the new data, it suggests that the Chinese population will be less than half of its current size as soon as 2050. So just from a demographic point of view, this is the last decade of China as a unified nation state. They're a dead man walking. Let's go beyond that. Okay, One Belt, One Road. This is an outcome of something the Chinese do with their financial system. So we give the Fed a lot of crap for monetizing and printing currency and all that good stuff. And on average, we do print a substantial amount. But the US dollar is used as the lubricant for the world's largest economy. We have another 20-odd currencies in the wider world that are linked to it. And it is the sole currency for international trade and the primary currency in terms of store of value. As such, the American increase in the money supply actually broadly correlates with those other factors combined. So do we play a little fast and loose with the rules? Sure. Will we pay for that down the road? Probably. The Chinese yuan is neither the store of value nor the currency of exchange. And yet the Chinese in any given month print 2 to 5 times as much currency as we do. Their overall money supply is over twice what ours is, and it's not internationally exchanged at all. They use that money to lubricate their systems to force capital into any company that might be able to employ people. So for us, the money supply is primarily an economic issue. For them, it's a political one, and it's treated appropriately. And that means that the Chinese are brimming with huge volumes of liquidity. And if you're someone in the know in China and you have access to that, it's a gold mine, because if you can get that currency out and exchange it for something else, anything else, even if the price is ridiculous, that means you've gotten some capital flight out and you have your rainy day fund. That's exactly what One Belt, One Road is on a global basis. Whenever you see the Chinese bidding $8 billion for something that's only worth $2 billion, that is not a sign of national strength. That is a sign of a corrupt bureaucrat who is establishing his nest egg. And they've now done that on a global basis. Now, there's lots of other impacts from this over-financialization, this hyper-financialization system. But overall, it does mean that each individual Chinese company of size could not survive in the global environment unless that money keeps coming. Other countries have tried various versions of this. Japan probably is at the top of that list. They're the ones who kind of designed the model. But eventually, you have sufficient exposure that you can't compete. And you start going down a Japanese-style economic malaise that in this case has lasted 30, 35 years already. The Japanese economy today is about the same size that it was in 1994 before the decline really got going. That is the best-case scenario for the future of China, a slow, long stagnation. But there's a lot of reasons to expect it to be a lot